In this video, I'm going to show you what's new in the July release of Home Assistant, the 2021.7 release. In case you weren't aware, at the beginning of this year, Home Assistant changed the way they release their updates, and they're committed to releasing a new version of Home Assistant every single calendar month. They name these versions based on the year and month in which it's released. So the July release is called 2021.7 because July is the 7th month. Let's take a look at what's changed.
Hey home automation guy. Start the show.
The source of truth for what's new is always the official Home Assistant release blog post, which I put a link in the description to below. The first addition in this release is a new type of entity called the Select entity. It's very similar to the old Input Select entity, which we've been able to use for a long time. However, the Select entity picks the values that can be chosen from a device, whereas the Input Select entity can be changed by the user. What this means is when you connect a device that has different modes, for example, like a smart fan, you can then pre-specify what speed that fan can run on, for example, such as low, medium, or high. The manufacturer can put the pre-programmed values into the device, which can now be read by MQTT or other Home Assistant integrations. You've always been able to trigger automations from multiple triggers. For example, let's say you want to send an alert to your mobile phone when any one of the 3 doors to outside is opened. You could always have done this. However, you would never know which of those doors actually triggered the automation. With this update, you can now assign an ID to each of these individual triggers, so you'll know which of the doors have been opened and cause the automation to be turned on. For example, you could send one type of notification if the front door is open and a different one if the back door is open without having to create 2 different automations. And speaking of triggers, you can now actually compare 2 different entity values in your triggers and your conditions. So you could always set an automation up that triggered something to happen when the temperature of a room went above a specific value, such as 20 degrees. But now you can trigger automations based on a comparison of 2 different sensors. So you could trigger the same automation not when it's hard-coded 20 degrees is hit, but when the temperature inside the house exceeds the temperature outside the house. Another small change in this release is an improvement to the way you can work with dates. This is probably more for your advanced users or your advanced automations, but you can now programmatically format dates using a new asDateTime method. This will make it a lot easier to compare different dates with each other or format them in ways that you want to see them. This next enhancement is also for advanced users. You can now trace the execution of scripts for debugging purposes, the same as you've been able to do since 2021.4 for automations. And now for those of us running Home Assistant in a Docker container, there have been some improvements to the way that Docker pulls down images in the versions that it uses. Previously, you could tell Docker to always pull the same version of the Docker container down, such as the 2021.6.2 release, where .2 is a minor release that came out during that month. The minor releases usually contain important bug fixes, security enhancements that can't wait till the next major release to come out. If a .3 version came out in that month as well, your Docker wouldn't update that until you went to edit the configuration file telling it to use that new specific 2021.6.3 version. So with this enhancement announced in this release, you're able to specify what major version you want to follow, and it will always pull the latest minor version as well, so you'll be sure to have the latest security and bug fixes for that particular version. So say you want to use the 2021.7 release in your Docker file. Every time you recreate that container, it will check to see if there's any minor version updates, such as 2021.7.1, .2, or .3, and automatically pull the latest version. When 2021.8 comes out, it won't update to that because that's a higher major version. This will help people like me that want to make sure they have the latest security and bug fixes available to their version, but don't want to risk breaking things by automatically upgrading to a major version. This release also brings a bunch of updates to the Z-Wave integration. These include a new service that allows you to set values across multiple devices simultaneously using multicast, and also new services that allow you to ping or get the status of your sensors programmatically. This is useful to check if any of your Z-Wave sensors have dropped off the network or stopped responding. They've also made it a lot easier for you to export your Z-Wave log files to help you with troubleshooting any issues. As always, there's a bunch of other noteworthy changes that are part of this release. I'm not going to go through them all in the video, and I suggest you go through this list yourself to see if there are any integrations listed here that you use to see if there's any improvements or changes made to them. The 2021.7 release also brings us a bunch of new inbuilt integrations. For example, there's now an integration to Ambi, which helps you determine the air quality and pollen count for your area. There's also now support for modern form smart devices, including their range of lights and fans, as well as an integration with forecast solar, which allows you to understand how much energy you may be generating from your solar panels based on the weather patterns in your area. Some integrations have actually got new platforms or sensors added to them as well. For example, the Sony Bravia television integration now has support for mimicking a remote control, so you can fake button presses on a remote control as part of your automations. Once again, I suggest you go to the Home Assistant website, scan through these changes to see if there are any improvements to any of the integrations that you use in your smart home. The Home Assistant developers are continuing their push to make Home Assistant more accessible to normal people and reducing the amount of YAML files people need to edit. These integrations here are now configured by the user interface rather than YAML files. And finally, there are a few breaking changes that are included as part of this release. I always suggest you go through this list and look at any of the integrations that you use to see if there's any updates you need to make to the automations or scripts in your environment. The developers occasionally change the way that integrations report information, either to make them more specific or bring them in line with other integrations for consistency. In this case, you may need to update some of your automations and scripts to bring in the information in the new way. For example, the GrowWatt integration is now changing the way that it reports power from watts to kilowatts. If you previously had an automation that was triggered by a certain wattage, you'll then need to go and change that to report it in kilowatts so that the automation behaves the same as before. Usually these changes are minor, but it's always best to go and check the list to make sure that nothing's going to change when you update your Home Assistant. Speaking of updating Home Assistant, if you're running the Home Assistant operating system on a Raspberry Pi or similar device, you can update this by going to the Supervisor section and then clicking the Update button. I always recommend that you take a snapshot or backup before you update Home Assistant to make sure you can roll back to a previous version if anything goes wrong during the update process. So that's the 2021.7 update of Home Assistant. Whilst there's nothing earth-shatteringly new in here, it's always good to know that the system that you're using is constantly updated and maintained by a series of developers. A lot of these changes were funded by Nabu-Casa, which is Home Assistant Cloud. Part of the subscription of Home Assistant Cloud goes to fund developers who continually work on improving Home Assistant. If you're not really sure what Nabu-Casa or Home Assistant Cloud is, check the video I've linked in the description where I go into it in a lot more detail. If you found this video useful, click the thumbs up button to let me know. I release regular videos on smart home automation and Home Assistant. So if this is something that you're interested in, click the subscribe button and together we can make your home smarter.